do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that her
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical implications of a community.
before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Since the conflict in Darfur began in 2003, an estimated 300,000 people have died and roughly 2.7 million have been displaced. Such numbers are staggering and often leave people thinking, that's terrible, but what can we do? Our next guest offers some suggestions. For 9 years, she's been taking students on service trips to the Dominican Republic. 4 years ago, she expanded these trips to include Tanzania. In 2007, she ventured to the Gaga refugee camp in Chad to speak with 25 Darfuri women who fled the genocide in Sudan. Ann De Reus is an associate professor of human development and women's studies at Penn State Altoona. She's also co-founder of the Centre County chapter of Save Darfur and recent recipient of the Carl Wilkins Fellowship, an honor given by the Genocide Intervention Network to 20 individuals across the country who have shown dedication to ending genocide. This past spring, she ventured to the Democratic Republic of Congo to talk with rape survivors. Ann De Reus, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You began student service trips over spring break more than 9 years ago, first to the Dominican Republic, yes, and then 4 years ago to Tanzania.
Yes.
What compelled a professor of health and human development and women's studies to take such untraditional or unconventional spring breaks?
Well, it really started with a student. I can't take full credit. So a freshman came to me when I first started at Penn State Altoona and said, I got this email about this trip to the Dominican Republic to work at an orphanage. I think I want to do this. Would you help me? And one thing led to another. And next thing we knew, we had a trip organized and we took students. 10 years later, I'm still going. The student isn't. She went once.
So 4 years ago, you end up in Tanzania, and just a couple of years ago, you and a colleague traveled to Tanzania on another student service trip. And once the students were safely home, you boarded an 8-seater UN plane, then took NGO cars and found your way in Chad, in a refugee camp. What compelled you to do that? Was it a whim? What's the story behind that?
Well, I knew about the genocide that was occurring in Sudan and had learned through these previous trips, particularly to the Dominican Republic, that I have a capacity for being able to handle difficult situations, humanitarian crises, and also feel a moral and ethical responsibility on some level to give back as a privileged person from the West, and thought, okay, if I'm going to give my time and my efforts, why not give them to the worst situations that exist in the world? And it doesn't get much worse than genocide. And when I knew we would be back in Africa, I thought, well, I'm on the continent. Why don't we see if we can't get there? Because if we can, then perhaps we can begin to do some work, humanitarian aid work, research, because I am an academic, that sort of thing. So we just decided, let's see if we can do this and what we can learn by doing it. And so we were able to actually get to the Gaga refugee camp in Chad and spend about 10 days in the country.
Now, we're talking about a challenging trip. Number one, you're having to deal with a male-dominated culture, a climate that is brutal, a travel situation that is less than ideal. What was it like?
It was very difficult. I think had we known how difficult it would be, we may not have actually taken it on. But it was very difficult. Getting in, you can get into the capital city, but then you have to get transportation to, it's just not safe to travel by car. It's about 15 hours to get to Abeche, which is kind of the base camp for all the humanitarian and UN aid organizations. So you have to literally hitch a ride on a UN World Food Program plane, which are just these little 8-seaters. And so there has to be a seat available. We had to split up because we couldn't all go at the same time. The heat was 133 degrees. You had to travel by an UN convoy simply because a lot of the vehicles were being hijacked and stolen by bandits on the road. And you drive down the road to the camp, there's an unexploded bomb on the side of the road. We were paying outrageous amounts of money to stay at a hotel. And for bottled water, a 2-liter bottle of water that actually tasted like gasoline and only became more distasteful as the water bottle heated up, and it's because the plastic was leaching the petroleum chemicals into the water, and in 133 degrees it was pretty, but what are you going to do? It's you have to stay hydrated, so you have to drink the water, and it was, you know, there were a lot of obstacles getting out as well. There was a misunderstanding, probably due to our inability to speak French very fluently, caused us to miss our international flight home. And so there were a lot of trials and tribulations to getting in and getting out.
You know, we've all seen horrifying news footage of Darfur. What was it that you saw that turned you from a sympathetic observer, you know, from the safety of your living room into someone who would do what you did?
Well, I guess the feeling, you can ask my mother about this. I've always had a strong sense of fairness and justice, and it just, those situations always move me, and my feeling is, and I don't know that I completely understand it either, it's just to know that I cannot not do this work, and feel that it's, I believe in the power of the individual to make a difference, and if I can contribute my efforts to work that's already been started together, I really do think we can be a force for positive change. So it's really about believing in the power of the individual.
You know, you hit on a key word, individual, because I think so often we look at Darfur as this collective tragedy. We look at the people as this collective group and not as individuals, and you've put a face on it.
And I think that's clearly the reason why we continue the work that we do. I mean, it was one thing for us to go through those trials and tribulations, but as soon as Lorraine and I and Wendy were sitting on those mats with the women and started hearing their individual stories and learned about the atrocities and cried with them, we looked at each other and had this knowing look of, this is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be here. And the women were asking us and saying, why isn't anyone doing anything? Why are we still in the camps? Has the world turned its back? And we made a commitment right then and there to the women that we would come back and share their stories. They have a voice, but they feel as if no one is listening.
Lorraine and Wendy, of course, are colleagues of yours.
Yes, Wendy being a student, actually, who traveled with us.
You mentioned the word genocide, and the word genocide comes from the Greek word geno, or race, and side, the Latin word for to kill or killing. What does the word mean, and when was it coined?
Raphael Lemkin was a lawyer by training who coined the term in the 40s, and his feeling was that there needed to be some way to try and express to people the horrors of intentional attacks, which is basically the definition. Genocide is the intentional attack of civilians, either through rape, torture, or murder. And then there's always this question about how do we define it? How do you know when it's actually happening? So organizations such as the Genocide Intervention Network will consider the type of violence and then also the magnitude of the violence. So if it's 10 people, is it genocide? Where do you draw the line? And so it is a bit complicated, but what is happening in Darfur has certainly met the criteria for being defined as genocide.
Now, the conflict in Darfur began in 2003. The U.S. Congress has declared it genocide back in 2004. Here we are, 2009. We've seen 300,000 Darfuris killed and 2.7 million displaced. Why has more not happened, especially given the fact that there is recognition that it's genocide?
Exactly, and that's a good question. Samantha Power, Pulitzer Prize-winning author who's written this book called Time from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, would say that the issue is lack of political will, that not everyone does have the knowledge. I think that our lay populations, if they knew about it, our average citizens, would actually put pressure on our elected officials to do something about this. I think part of the problem is a lack of awareness. However, I would say that most of our elected officials do know that this is happening. And it's unless there is a call by the constituency to do something about this, then we continue to not address the issue. At the same time, there have been some positive developments. Some positive things are happening, which, especially with this new administration, which does indicate to us that we are taking steps in the right direction. The thing is, it's not enough, and we need to be doing so much more.
Before we find out what we need to be doing, explain to us, we've all heard and seen the news clips about Darfur, but I think few people really understand the basis or the origin of that conflict.
It's complicated, as is the history of most countries on that continent. In this case, it's really a north-south split in the country, and it's been exacerbated by colonialism, which has driven the divisions that are ethnic, religious, and tribal. So you end up with a current situation where there's this split between the North and the South. The North is primarily Arab and Muslim. The South is primarily Black and either Christian or represents an indigenous belief system. You have the North that believes that they are better than the people of the South. But of course, the South has tremendous oil reserves, and so there are all of these issues. At the same time, you have this region called Darfur to the west that is about the size of Texas and originally was home to about 6 million people, that has not had a voice at the table and has been continually marginalized. It is primarily people who are Black and farmers who are not similar ethnically to the people who live in what is technically considered the North, so your Arabs and the Muslims. In 2003, then some rebel groups formed in Darfur and said, we've had enough, and decided to fight back. Well, in response to that, then Khartoum, Omar al-Bashir, who came to power during a coup and is a ruthless dictator, decided that, okay, we're going to exterminate the people of the Darfur region. And so militias were formed, government-backed militias called the Janjaweed, which literally means devils on horseback. And it's been those individuals who have been coming into villages, destroying them, raping the women, basically committing genocide, trying to wipe out the population.
Omar al-Bashir was named by Parade magazine just a little while ago as the world's second most dangerous dictator. But you've done a lot of work on race, and as you were talking about this, I was thinking of a subtitle of one of the papers you wrote, which was "White Matters," and I'm wondering, would we be talking about this ongoing genocide in Darfur if the victims were white?
It's a good question. I think that a lot what determines whether we as a nation or as a global community respond to these situations or not is determined by color of skin. I think there are issues around whether we are willing to step up and take a stand and help or not. And I think that clearly is an issue. I think there are also economic interests that generally drive our involvement or lack of involvement in a particular area. So I think in this case especially, this is about whether we have economic interests there or not. These are complicated situations. Omar al-Bashir has had a lot of intelligence information about Osama bin Laden, and the Bush administration was very interested in receiving pieces of that information to assist us in our own hunt for bin Laden. Complicates the relationship there when we need that information, and at the same time there's a genocide that's occurring.
Well, speaking of complicating, on March 4th, 2009, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, issued a warrant for his arrest for genocide and crimes against humanity. And the result, of course, was that aid workers were expelled from the country, only exacerbating the problem you've seen. I want to go back for a minute and find out, what did you see? What was it like in the Gaga refugee camp? I'm talking, what does it look like, smell like? What did you hear?
That camp is a little more fortunate than some of the others because it's so close to the town of Abeche, where the humanitarian aid organizations are based. So logistically, geographically, they have an advantage because aid can get there easier. The camps that are farther away, that are on the Sudanese border or just over the border into Sudan, have the worst situation because of the Janjaweed and the difficulty in actually getting supplies there. However, the camp that we were in was originally built for 5,000, and there were 15,000 refugees that were there when we visited. So they were literally bursting at the seams. What we learned from the women that we spoke to is that they're constantly hungry. They said they're not starving, but they are constantly hungry. Their children are complaining, so the women are eating less to give their rations to the children, and so they themselves are going without. That was a constant problem. This camp of 15,000 people who have been traumatized have one psychologist for 15,000 people. And so you can't even begin to meet the needs of people who are in distress. That was really unfortunate. You know, there are issues. I mean, they have housing, but it's tents that have been provided by the UN, and with the intense heat and the winds and the sand, that canvas starts to break down with time. They're not large enough.
And how long have they been there?
They have been there, that camp has been there, I believe, since 2004. And so they've been there for some time. I mean, some children in that camp know nothing else other than life in that camp to this point. And who knows how long that they will be there.
You talked with some 25 women. Mm-hmm. You know, you read about children who are kidnapped, families who are separated. Mm-hmm. Can there be some semblance of a family in this environment? Mm-hmm. And how receptive were these women to talking to you and to your colleagues?
That's the part that was amazing to us. We had no idea whether women would be willing to speak to us or not. Why should they? Share their stories. It's painful. But what we were stunned to realize was that this was very important to them. The women, the word got out, it spread through the camp that there were these white Westerners who were there who would be interested in hearing stories, and the women came in droves and would literally wait in a particular area for hours with their babies, often, you know,
to talk with you,
to talk with us. And we were amazed by that because our conversations were one-on-one, and we were surprised.
Through a translator?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And so that was what we asked them about, was what it was like to raise a family in the camp. And I think the lesson that all of us came away with was the tremendous resiliency and strength of these women, because given everything that they've been through, not knowing how long they will be in those camps and when they might be able to return home, if they'll be able to return home, and yet they still could laugh with us. They still could talk about things that were joyous in their lives. They still function as parents. They're cooking meals and providing what we observed as great parenting, and how they're able to do that in the face of all of this was astonishing.
Well, this is interesting because I keep coming back to your day job, if you will, as a professor of child development and family studies, and you've done a lot of work on child development in the context of poverty, and so I'm surprised I'm thrilled to hear that they're still functioning as families, but given what they've been through, if we could change the situation tomorrow, what does this mean for children some who were born in refugee camps?
Exactly. I think the biggest issue for most of the children that are in the camps, it's the trauma that they've experienced, the things that they've witnessed, the amount of loss, and usually through really atrocious means. Those are going to be the biggest issues for these children, and whether their psychological needs will be met or not.
But compounded with starvation or at least nutritional deficits.
Exactly. Which, you know, you wonder then what will become of them as adults, and whether there will be, because we know this is the sort of thing that can lead to further conflict in the future when this generation is older. What does that mean for them in terms of their feelings about the reasons why they have ended up in that particular camp. So will they pick up arms as adults to fight back? That's exactly why we need to pay particular attention to these generations of children, make sure they're getting educated, the psychological care that they need, so that they don't grow up to be a group that wants to fight back in some way. And what we have learned from the women is that they very much want to go home, and it's not about revenge. We asked them, do you feel like there need to be reparations for what has happened to you, for the cattle that were stolen or the land that was taken? And in virtually every case, the women said, no, that's not an issue for us. We just want to go home. And even though they know their villages have been destroyed, does not matter. They want to go back. They want to rebuild. It's not about reparations. It's not about revenge. It's about going home.
I went out on the internet and looked at some blogs to see how people were reacting to the situation in Darfur and elsewhere. And there's a certain segment of the population, both in the UK and here, who are blogging and saying we need to do something, and we need to do something now. Then there's another group that says that Darfur is not our problem. Others who say the UN should be moved to Europe. Another, the UNC, the African Union, Islamic countries should be dealing with the problems in Darfur and in the Congo. Why, in your opinion, do you feel that what happens in Rwanda and Somalia and Sudan, why is it our problem?
There are actually multiple responses to that, or multiple reasons why it is our problem. I think from a very pragmatic standpoint, there's an issue of stability in a region. So we can look at it just strictly from a foreign policy and political perspective, which says that we have to have stability in these regions. When we don't have stability, then we have upheaval. It leads to further conflicts where we may need to get involved on a greater level. So we need to have stabilized regions of the world. So there's that particular reason. There's a humanitarian reason, a responsibility to protect that is really, as global citizens and as nations, if a government is not protecting its citizenry in the way that it should, then the rest of the world has a responsibility to protect. It doesn't mean that we're not doing work here at home and on our own soil. That's great. The more people we have doing efforts abroad, domestically, that's what we need. It's not an either-or situation. It's a both and. I would also like to think that if something were happening on our soil, that someone else in another part of the world would care and would come to our aid. I mean, we really are a global community. We have the influence as a nation. We certainly have enough individuals in influential positions who have the knowledge. But where's the level of accountability?
Each generation, it seems, declares never again or not on my watch. And if you look at genocide in the 20th century, I think most of us will acknowledge and are very familiar with the Nazi Holocaust and even perhaps with Rwanda or with Bosnia. But if you go through history, depending upon how you're counting, there can be 8, 9, 10 major genocides. Armenians in Turkey, 1915 to 1918, 1.5 million deaths. Stalin's forced famine, 1932 to 1933, 7 million deaths. Give us a little history of genocide, and is it different in modern times than it was in ancient times? Because it's really been around since the beginning of time.
And each time it's about this creation of the other, and this notion of the other based on differences, whether be they religious, tribal, or ethnic, and this notion that there aren't enough resources to go around, competition for a piece of the pie. We are different from each other. I don't speak your language, or we practice different religions, and you are a threat. So when people's needs are not being met themselves, then that competition for resources becomes heightened, and we are more likely to pick up arms and fight our own brothers and sisters. And I think that's one of the parts that's difficult for this, and another reason why we have difficulty creating political will is I think that we have to recognize that part of each one of us, that at what point would I have participated in any of these atrocities? And
we all think we wouldn't.
Exactly. And I think that that is a very difficult place for us to go in our own minds. And I think that until we recognize the possibility of that within each of us, it's more difficult for us to create political will.
Well, I'm thinking of Rwanda. In 100 days, 800,000 Tutsis, that's 1/10 of the population of Tutsis was wiped out. And it was described as the fastest, the most effective killing spree, maybe in history. Yet, and Samantha Power talks about the fact that we knew what was going on, not just us, not just the United States, and did nothing to stop it. Even something as simple as scrambling hate radio. Right, exactly. And it's one of those situations that I think there's been considerable regret by President Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright for the lack of U.S. response or involvement in that situation. And fortunately, because of that, Madeleine Albright in particular has been very involved with talking about helping to draft policy and strategies for prevention of future genocides, because we stood by while that atrocity unfolded. And I think for many individuals, leaders and citizens alike, we learned a lesson from that and said, we absolutely cannot stand by while these situations unfold. And so I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing momentum towards efforts in Darfur. I mean, one of the things that we need to remember is that, yes, what has happened is awful, but what if we hadn't done as much as we've already done? So humanitarian aid groups have been there and have been on the ground and have been working. There has been a diplomatic response on some level. It's not enough. But imagine how much more worse, dire the situation would have been if we hadn't done at least as much as we've done to this point. You're really talking about at least a modest effort, and Power says this in her book. She doesn't claim that the U.S. alone could have prevented the horrors, but she does make a convincing case that even modest efforts could have made a significant impact. And I'm wondering if you can cite examples, even in Darfur, what modest at least effort could make a difference. Well, I think right now the most important issue is getting these humanitarian aid groups back into the region. And so, you know, it can be smaller things, and this is where we've had success with Representative Bill Schuster. The UN forces there need helicopters. It's as simple as 24 helicopters that they need in order to improve the work that they're doing there. Ukraine has stepped forward and said, we will donate the helicopters to the UN forces there. What needs to happen is we need to facilitate, the U.S. can facilitate that process. Our local Save Darfur group went to Representative Schuster and said, listen, you sit on the appropriate committees, you have sway, could you please send a letter to Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense Gates, and asking them to help facilitate this process with Ukraine. Not buy the helicopters, just help get them there. Well, and that's the beauty of this situation. It's not about the U.S. buying them. It requires no outlay from the U.S. financially. It requires no equipment, troops, nothing. It's simply facilitating the process so that the Ukraine can get these 24 helicopters to the UN troops. Something as simple as that will help deter the Janjaweed in that area and better enable the UN troops to carry out their mission there. Speaking of other small steps, the Jewish World Watch has come up with these solar cookers
Yes.
that free women from the sometimes deadly chore of collecting firewood and bringing it back to camp. These are made of tin. Tell us, did you see these solar cookers in the Gaga camp where you were?
They actually had not at that point actually brought the solar cookers to the Gaga refugee camp. However, I'm very familiar with them because of the work that Jewish World Watch is doing and some of our efforts that we've done locally to raise money to be able to purchase solar cookers. And they are amazing. I mean, it's ingenious. A Dutch company, some engineers came up with this design of a cardboard box with a coated silver reflective surface that will heat a pot, in the sun to a high enough temperature to actually cook food. And they last about 6 months. They are inexpensive and lightweight to ship. So for $15, a person in the United States can actually purchase a solar cooker and make a difference for a family in a camp. So there are so many from things on the national level, like getting these, pushing for the securement or procurement of these helicopters, to smaller things an individual can do, like buying a solar cooker. There's a lot that individuals can do.
We were talking a moment ago about Rwanda, and Carl Wilkins was the only American who chose to remain in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide began. A fellowship was named in his honor, and you were one of 20 people around the country to receive a fellowship. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's really been a terrific opportunity, and I feel so fortunate to have received the fellowship. As you said, it was named in honor of Carl Wilkins, and this is something that's been made possible through an organization called the Genocide Intervention Network. And the mission of Genocide Intervention Network is to provide the tools to individuals and to communities to be able to take a stand against genocide, so beyond what's happening in Darfur. The idea is that, and through this fellowship in particular, that the Genocide Intervention Network wants to create a permanent anti-genocide constituency across the United States. The strategy is that if you identify 20 of your strongest and leading activists on the anti-genocide movement from around the country, provide them with additional skills and opportunities, it's a way to further create a base within the United States so that you have political will and it's very much a grassroots effort to get individuals aware, involved, provide them with the tools to do that, and then in turn go to their elected officials and say, this is a priority, this matters to us. What are you going to do?
I want to find out what you have done, but I want to find out more about these 20 people who are part of this fellowship. You're a professor. You talked about housewives who are among the 20.
Yes.
A Hollywood lawyer, I think you said, is another.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the makeup of this group and the kinds of efforts that they're undertaking.
Well, I'll tell you, when I met the rest of them, I couldn't help but ask myself, how is it that I was able to be a part of this? Because the 19 other fellows are just these incredible human beings and activists from across the United States, from housewives to entertainment attorneys, who have rallied their communities, have worked diligently in their states to get legislation passed. I mean, the work that they're doing is absolutely incredible. So a fabulous group, and we were able to spend a weekend together at Genocide Intervention Network headquarters in Washington, D.C. for a retreat as we kind of strategized and came up with our own visions about what we would be doing in our respective states. And just to be in the same room with a group of people who are so knowledgeable and share the same passion was really inspiring for all of us, I believe. And now it's a tight group. We have conference calls. We're doing all sorts of things, staying in contact with each other, supporting each other, helping each other come up with ideas about what we might be doing. And it's just been incredible. And, this is, as is Carl Wilkins. He is an incredibly compassionate human being who has now devoted his life to speaking about the horrors of Rwanda and talking about ways that people can make a difference and get involved. And so Carl truly is the inspiration at the center of all of this, and has been, it's just fabulous that we have this opportunity.
You've started in Central Pennsylvania, Save Darfur, Central Pennsylvania chapter. What kinds of projects have you undertaken to date?
It's a terrific group. I feel really fortunate to have had this opportunity in Central PA, and who would have known that all of the great things that have happened would come out of it. We've got over 80 members. I've got a core group of 30. We meet monthly, and we've been doing all sorts of things. From, as I mentioned, it was 2 of our Save Darfur members who had a personal connection with Representative Bill Schuster, who were able to have that face-to-face meeting with him and deliver our letter and request for his involvement on this issue. That's been our latest success. We just last night had a meeting with local high school students, representatives from about 8 different area high schools. We're getting something started called the Youth Action Network that's all about education and action. And it will be on issues of genocide, but also looking in our own backyards and looking within our state. So we've got the Youth Action Network going. Last year about this time, we also coordinated an effort with high school students. In one evening, the students had a concert and raised over $10,000. That was matched by our local Save Darfur group. And the students were then able to decide where the money would be distributed, how it would be donated. And they were able to allocate $20,000 to various aid organizations who were doing work in Darfur and in Chad. So we feel as if we've had tremendous success locally. We've been, because of my time in Chad, and now because of the fellowship, I've probably given 50 presentations locally in schools. Teachers keep inviting me in. Can you please come? I was just recently at Northern Bedford. Can you please come and talk about what's happening there and show your slides, share the story? And so that's a lot of what we've been doing, is raising awareness.
How difficult was it for you to leave those 25 women after you heard their stories? And I'm also wondering, did that being an eyewitness kind of toughen your resolve to go home and do something about it?
Well, I think that's exactly what it was. We were so inspired by their courage and resiliency and strength that we really felt as it put everything into perspective for us. Not only the trials and tribulations that we had getting in and getting out of the country, but also just our own lives. Really, it was a very centering experience, and absolutely inspired us to come back and to try and tell their stories and raise awareness about what was happening. It was difficult to leave simply because I knew the life that I was coming back to and what these women would continue to face on a daily basis. I have every intention of going back and reconnecting with the women that we met. It's just very difficult to get in, and there's concerns about another attack on the capital city. And so getting back in right now my timing's not the best, but I will return. Tell
us a little bit about really the result of what Raphael Lemkin did, is that we now have the Genocide Conventions of 1948. Tell us about whose jurisdiction it is and how successful, for instance, the International Criminal Court is in prosecuting these cases. Have we been effective at it?
Well, if you're a signatory to the convention, then you have a moral and a legal obligation to respond. And that's where we have fallen short as a signatory to that convention. So that is a fact and an issue that is raised repeatedly. We have a moral obligation, and we're not doing enough. The International Criminal Court has responded. They are comprised of 108 different countries. Now, the U.S. is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So with that warrant, the understanding is that if Omar al-Bashir should step foot in a country that is part of the International Criminal Court, then they would have a responsibility to arrest him.
But if he stays in Darfur?
Yes. And he has basically thumbed his nose at the International Criminal Court and has been traveling out of the country, but it's 2 countries who are not represented on the International Criminal Court. So he remains at large.
Rwanda, meantime, the president of Rwanda was tried, and he was tried for crimes against humanity, including using rape as a weapon.
Yes, and so there have been some convictions that have occurred at some of these war tribunals, and that one is taking place in Tanzania. And there have been some convictions. So the process works. The system needs to be supported. For example, the International Criminal Court. we believe in the process and trust in the process. It needs to be allowed to do its work, but it needs to be supported in the work that it's doing. So,
what does it need? I mean, tell us, what more should the U.S. be doing?
Well, what we really need is at this point, because we are not members of the International Criminal Court, we should be pressuring the countries who are to step up and to arrest Bashir if he's on their soil. You know, China in particular.
Why aren't we a member of that court?
We could do another entire show on that. The feeling has been, if the U.S. is a member of the court, then we are also we could also be subjected to penalties, to arrest warrants, etc. And so there's concern that
so in other words, someone in the Bush administration could be held liable for the war in Iraq, for example.
Absolutely, yes, yes. So there's that, again, that level of accountability that exists that we are not being held to.
One of the charges for the fellows of the Carl Wilkins Fellowship is to keep an eye on hotspots around the world. And Ben Kiernan, who's the author of Blood and Soil, says to prevent genocide, you have to see it coming. Are there other places that you and others who are part of that fellowship are worried about?
Absolutely. In fact, Genocide Intervention Network has what they define as areas of concern, and that have not been officially labeled as genocide. And so there are 8 areas total that they are concerned with. So Darfur being one has been labeled as genocide. Then you also have the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're looking at Burma, Iraq, Chad, the Central Republic of Africa. So there are total, Sri Lanka, Somalia, 8 places total that Genocide Intervention Network is keeping an eye on.
And the label of genocide is an important one. With Rwanda, even though today we will all admit that it was genocide, the UN and the US did everything but label it genocide. What happens when you label it genocide?
Well, then we are bound by the convention on prevention and punishment for crimes of genocide. And that is a legal obligation. And so if you can avoid the term, you can avoid, again, a level of accountability and not have to intervene.
Now, you are going on another service trip to Congo. Congo is a place where in the last 8 years, millions of people have been killed. Tell me a little bit about why you're going there.
Actually, this will be a research project for myself, but it's more than that. For me, this is really, again, about raising awareness. Congo right now is considered, it's been labeled 2 things. It's been labeled the worst humanitarian crisis. It's also been labeled the worst place in the world to be a woman. Hundreds of thousands of women have been raped, and from my perspective, again, this is one of those worst case scenarios, worst atrocities, and so awareness needs to be raised. People are starting to know about Darfur there. It's on people's radar screens to a certain extent. We still have a lot more to do in terms of education. But when I ask people, have you heard about the Democratic Republic of Congo and what's happening there? Fewer people know about that. It just is not in the press. Really, people do not know. If it hadn't been for Anderson Cooper's piece on 60 Minutes about what's happening, even fewer people would know about it.
In fact, the Pulitzer Prize winner for drama wrote a play called Ruined, which is about the tragedy in the Congo.
Exactly. Eve Ensler, is that, yes? Is that who you're referring to?
I don't think that's her name. I can't remember her name, but that's not her name.
So there have been a couple of playwrights. Eve Ensler is another one who just recently visited Congo and has been writing plays using women's testimonies, again, to try and raise awareness. She was just in the United States doing a 5-city tour, which included Dr. Mukwege, who is the incredible human being from Pansy Hospital who repairs women's bodies. And that man works 16 hours a day day in surgery, trying to restore them. And he's incredible. And so he came to also raise awareness.
And you're really talking about what he's dealing with are literally tens of thousands of rapes and mutilations, sexual mutilations. How did rape become such an important weapon of war?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, and sadly enough, rape as a tactic of war has been around since the beginning of time. I mean, it's been used as a way to demoralize a population, to destroy a population. I mean, women do 70% of, we do 2/3 of the world's labor and work. If you destroy the women, even if it's emotionally and psychologically you've destroyed them, then you have a much better opportunity and chance for, taking a region or taking over a country. So it's a way to demoralize an entire village and then gain access to and take over an entire region. So by attacking the women, you have positioned yourself better to be able to take the spoils of war.
Women's studies really launched on the scene on campuses around the country in 1969 or 1970, and they're involved. The topics that they're focused on are feminism and women and politics and social transformation. And I look at this, what you're doing, as a sort of feminist activism, and I'm wondering, is feminism activism different from social activism?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it depends on your definition of feminism, and there are many definitions for that. I do use feminist theory in my work. I do label myself as a feminist, and for me, it's about people having choice, not just women, but people having choice in their lives. And it's a human rights, for me, it's a human rights issue. So my feminism informs what it is that I'm doing, but it brings me to look at issues around power, who has the power, who doesn't, and what's happening, what's the status of women and girls in a particular place. So it does very much frame the work that I'm doing, and for me, feminism implies activism, and so it's not enough to just study a particular issue and to know about it, but you're compelled to take action.
That brings me to this next question, and that is, how is genocide different for women in terms of victimization, participation, and consequences?
Well, they certainly have been a target. Not that men have not been a target as well. It depends on the strategies of the ruthless dictator or the groups who are trying to annihilate another population. Women have taken a role I know in Rwanda, for example, women were committing some of the atrocities that were there. So we're not exempt. Women are not exempt from participating in some of these atrocities as well. But they certainly have taken the brunt of it as victims around the world in any of these atrocities that you'd mentioned before. So they've been perpetrators, but they've primarily been victims. And women, unfortunately, are often second-class citizens in some male-dominated cultures, and so they're viewed as expendable. And they are part and parcel of the loss of war, the spoils of war.
Sometimes we use the word genocide, but there's also femicide or gendercide, and I'm wondering, in Guatemala, the targets seem to be males, but in a lot of these other countries, it does seem to be disproportionately aimed at women.
Exactly, and those are fairly controversial, and they're certainly loaded terms. You don't see them adopted. It's not language that's used by most of the probably leading activist or anti-genocide organizations like Genocide Intervention Network or Save Darfur. You don't see them using words like genocide. You will see the women's groups, the feminist groups who will use it. It's a provocative term. It is a way to initiate discourse and bring attention. So there is some value to using those labels. But again, it's not the language that is defined in the convention. And so if we're going to talk about accountability and a legal obligation, then we need to stick with genocide.
I want to get back for a minute to the Congo, which again is where your next service trip is. We're talking about a country that's the size of Western Europe, and it's been at war for 8 years. More than 4 million people have died, and this fighting is over resources. We're talking about gold, we're talking about oil, and we're talking about something that most of us have never heard of before, and that's coltan. And this is used in wireless laptops and in cell phones, and it's something that the Western world, that the developed world uses every day without ever thinking that we have some link to what's happening in the Congo. Tell us about that. And the reason I ask is, if we know what our link is, will it matter? Will it change the hearts and minds of those who can say this is 4,000 miles ago and it doesn't affect me?
Exactly. That is what's driving the conflict in Congo. It's the scramble for the resources there. It's one of the most mineral-rich countries in all of Africa, and the three hot commodities are tin, tantalum, and another one, coltan. They are, as you said, used in every single piece of electronics, whether it's your digital camera, your cell phone, your stereo, whatever it is. We've created the demand for that. No one demands electronics more than Westerners do. And those electronics cannot function without those minerals as a component. The good news is we have precedent for something comparable, which is around diamonds and what happened with the diamond industry.
Blood diamonds. When we got news of it, people demanded that if they're going to buy diamonds, they want to make sure that they aren't blood diamonds. No one died or was maimed in the mining of these.
Exactly. And so there was some oversight and regulation that was put into place for that, so that a person could walk into the local jewelry store and say, I want to purchase jewelry. I want to know that that's not a blood diamond. And the pieces were in place to ensure that. They're going to use that, hopefully, as that model can be adopted in this situation as well, to make sure that we are not buying cell phones that have any one of these mineral components that are coming from sources that we would
slave labor.
Exactly. That is all very much in the beginning stages. What it's going to take is individuals like us saying
to ask.
So, for example, I'm due for an upgrade with my phone. I will go to the company and I will say, I'm due for an upgrade. I'd like to do that, but can you tell me? But I want a phone that doesn't include any connections to Congo.
My guess is you're going to get a lot of bleary-eyed people saying, I have no idea.
Exactly.
It sounds to me like you'll have to go to the right people, but this is how it starts, I think, because I think we can with confidence buy fair trade coffee and fair trade chocolate.
And more people are demanding those sorts of things. As the awareness is created, again, it all comes back to education. People are buying locally. They know about divestment now. They don't want their money going to, petro oil company, in Darfur, that sort of thing. So people are becoming aware. They're learning that they actually, with their purchasing power, can make a difference. The same thing will happen in this case, but it all has to start with us.
President Obama, when during his campaign, I should say, he vowed that he would make ending the genocide in Darfur priority one, or something, actually a priority from day one, excuse me. Have you seen evidence of that?
We have. It speaks to his commitment that within his first 100 days in office that he did appoint a special envoy.
We're talking about General Gratian, who does have special knowledge of Africa.
Exactly. He's considered an expert. He will now be the special envoy. That absolutely indicates President Obama's commitment, but it's not enough. He will need to have a special team. It's going to be in place, and it can't be a substitute or a gesture. It can't be a substitute for the other diplomatic work that needs to happen. So we still need Secretary of Defense Gates. We need Secretary Clinton also very much involved in this. They need to work as a team on the issue.
I want to read something that Samantha Power wrote in her book. Without strong leadership, the system will incline toward risk-averse policy choices. No U.S. president has ever suffered politically for his indifference to genocide, and so it rages on. What can concerned citizens do so that that indifference is a thing of the past?
Well, I think the good news is there is some momentum that's been created. We have a president in office now who is committed to this issue. We have the special envoy in place. we've seen, activist groups forming across the country, students in high schools getting involved. There really is a groundswell and momentum. So now what we need to do is to get more people involved on that. And there are multiple things that people can do. We mentioned the solar cookers before. For as little as $15, a donation to Jewish World Watch, people can purchase a solar cooker, make a difference for a family in a camp. One of the other very simple things that people can do is call 1-800-GENOCIDE. This is a hotline that's provided through Genocide Intervention Network. It's free. It's a toll-free call. It's very simple. They give you all the prompts, and it directly connects you to your representative, to your senator, and to the White House. And they give you the talking points. Very simple, very brief messages.
And it makes a difference?
Absolutely it does. There is someone in each one of those offices whose job is to record the number of calls that they get and on what issues. It makes a tremendous difference. Part of the reason that we've seen even this issue on the radar screen for the Obama administration is because of grassroots efforts and individuals saying we care about this and taking a stand against genocide.
Now, we just celebrated Genocide Prevention Month, which was in April, and remarkably and coincidentally, a lot of the major genocides of the 20th century, Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, Cambodia, the Holocaust, the Armenian Holocaust, they all have major anniversaries in April.
Yes.
But 50 organizations, 10 countries, they're all asking their governments, superpowers in the world, to make genocide a national and international priority and to do something now about Darfur. So I want to close by finding out just how optimistic are you that something real is going to happen to save Darfur?
Well, when I hear the commitment that President Obama has, in his words, as when he was running for the office, he made the commitment, and he has stepped up now by appointing the special envoy. That's good. When I see that happening, when I work with organizations like the Genocide Intervention Network and know about these other fellows across the country who are doing amazing work, when I meet with high school students like I did last night who are talking about Darfur and know what it is and want to know how they can make a difference, that's where I see the hope in turning this around. We've got momentum. I think this will continue to push the tide. If each one of us picks up the phone, calls 1-800-GENOCIDE, educates ourselves, gets involved, talks to our representatives and says, I care about this. What are you going to do? That's how we will create the political will. I am optimistic. Things are happening. It's not as fast as we would like. It's not enough, but we're getting there and lives are being saved.
Ann De Reus, thanks so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for our conversation with Ann De Reus, Associate Professor of Human Development and Women's Studies at Penn State Altoona. To learn more about De Reus's experiences in Africa, including her most recent trip to the Congo, check out conversations.psu.edu. And we look forward to seeing you for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.